Hey, everybody. Just getting the link in the chat. Link in the chat. Good times. Link in the chat. Cool. It's a good one. You'll enjoy this. I was waiting for. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for hanging in there. You know, like Sophia said this morning, we're all just really getting tired of this computer thing. Not just you guys, like the teachers too. Everybody, like we've really been hanging in there. I'm gonna still try to make things interesting. We're doing the magazine, and um, we still have to make our roly-poly palaces. So we'll try to do some good stuff. Try to do some fun stuff and not get too tired. All right, thank you all 7 of you who are joining me now. Appreciate you hanging in there. Chapter 17. When we last left our heroes, Judge Gantry nodded slightly, but said nothing. I'll think about it, he said. And Ike gave him that amazing idea about not having the jury deliberate on Saturday. Like, have them go on Monday. That's Judge Gantry's style to, like, let's do this. We're going to finish it on Saturday. No. This is not emergency surgery, as he said. So, we'll see what goes. All right, 10 of us watching. I'm going to get going. Chapter 17. Once the jurors had taken their seats and the courtroom was quiet, all eyes were on Judge Gantry. He said, Mr. Nance, I believe you have one more witness. Clifford Nance stood straight and important and said with drama, Your Honor, the defense calls Mr. Peter Duffy himself. The tension was suddenly thick as the defendant made his way to the witness chair. Like, is he going to blow it, you know? After 4 long days of this trial, the accused would take the stand and tell his side of the story. But in doing so, he'd also subject himself to questions from the prosecution. How does a courtroom work? The defendant gets to take the witness stand and speak on his own behalf, but the prosecution also gets to cross-examine him. Theo knew that in 65% of murder cases, the defendant actually does not testify. Ooh. And he knew the reasons why. First, they're usually guilty, and they can't withstand a clever and nasty cross-examination from the prosecution. Second, they usually have a record of prior criminal activity, and once the witness stand, the record becomes fair game. In every trial, the judge tries to explain to the jury that the defendant does not have to testify, does not have to say a word or produce any witnesses on their behalf. The burden is on the state to prove him guilty. But Theo also knew that jurors are suspicious of a defendant who will not testify to save his own neck. If they were suspicious of Pete Duffy, Theo couldn't actually tell. They watched him closely as he settled into the witness chair. He raised his right hand and he swore to tell the truth. Do you present the whole truth and nothing but the truth? So help you God, I do. Theo could see it all. Because, thanks to Judge Gantry, he was sitting in a ringside seat in the second row, behind the defense, with Ike to his right and his father to his left. His mother had appointments back at the office. She said she couldn't waste the afternoon sitting through a trial, though it was obvious to the other 3 Boones that she really wanted to. Clifford Nance cleared his throat and asked the defendant to state his name, a necessary but rather silly thing to do under the circumstances. Everyone in the courtroom not only knew Pete Duffy, but also knew a lot about him. Mr. Nance began a series of simple questions. He took his time establishing the basics. Mr. Duffy's family history, his education, job, business, lack of criminal record, so on. The 2 spent hours rehearsing all this, obviously, and the witness settled into his routine. He often glanced over at the jurors in an effort to establish an easy conversational tone. "Trust me," he was almost trying to say, with his body language and voice. He was a nice-looking man. He had a stylish suit, and this struck Theo as a little odd because none of the 5 male jurors wore a coat or tie. Theo had read articles about the strategy for what lawyers and clients should wear during the trial. The back and forth finally got around to saying something important when Mr. Nance brought up the subject of the $1 million insurance policy on the life of Mrs. Myra Duffy. The witness explained that he was a firm believer in life insurance and that he was a young man with a young wife and young children. He'd always saved his money and invested in life insurance, both for himself and his wife. Life policies are valuable tools to protect the family in the event of an untimely death. Later, when he married his second wife, Myra, he insisted on purchasing life insurance, and Myra agreed. In fact, the $1 million policies were actually her idea. She wanted protection in case something happened to him. Though he seemed unable to completely relax, Mr. Duffy was believable. The jurors listened carefully. So did Theo. And more than once he reminded himself that he was watching the biggest trial in Strattenberg's history. Plus, he was also skipping school as an excuse. From the life insurance, Mr. Nance moved the conversation to Mr. Duffy's business ventures, and here the witnesses scored well. He admitted that some of his real estate deals had gone sour, and that some of the banks were squeezing him, that he'd lost partners, and he had made mistakes. His humility was touching and very well received by the jurors. It made him even more believable. He strongly denied that he was even remotely close to bankruptcy and rattled off an impressive series of steps he was taking to unload debt and save his assets. Some of it was over Theo's head, and he didn't understand, and he suspected a few of the jurors were slightly confused too. It didn't matter. Clifford Nance had his client thoroughly prepared. Under the state's theory, the motive for killing was money and greed. This theory was looking weaker and weaker right now as he testified. Mr. Nance then moved the delicate matter to Mr. Duffy's marital troubles, and here again the witness did a fine job. He admitted things had been rocky. Yes, they had been to marriage counselors. Yes, they had consulted separate divorce lawyers. Yet there had been fights, but none of them were violent. And he had moved out on one occasion, a miserable 1-month period that made him even more determined to patch things up. At the time she was killed, they were together and happy and making plans for the future. Another whack at the prosecution's theory. As the afternoon wore on, Clifford Nance steered the testimony to the subject of golf, where they spent a lot of time, too much time, in Theo's humble opinion. Mr. Duffy was adamant in his assertions that he always preferred to play golf alone, and he had been doing so for decades. Mr. Nance produced a file, explained to the judge that contained his client's scorecards that dated back 20 years. He handed one to the witness, who identified it. It was from a golf course in California 14 years earlier. He had shot an 81, 9 over par. He played that alone. One scorecard followed another, and the testimony soon became a tour of golf courses all over the United States. Pete Duffy played a lot of golf. He was serious. He kept his records, and he played alone. He went on to explain that he also played with friends, played for business, and he played with his son when he got the chance. But he preferred to play alone on an empty course. When the tour was over, there seemed little doubt that another of the prosecution's theories had been shot down. The notion that Pete Duffy had been planning the murder for 2 years and that he began playing golf alone so he could pull it off with no witnesses around seemed unlikely now. Theo kept thinking, there are 4 people in this crowded room who know the truth. Me, Ike, my dad, and Pete Duffy. We know he killed his wife. I kept thinking, this guy's about to walk and there's nothing we can do. It's like the perfect crime. Woods Boone kept thinking, how can we find the mysterious witness and bring him in before it's too late? The last scorecard from the day of the murder. Mr. Duffy had played 18 holes, shot 6 over par, and played alone. Of course, the scorecard had been kept from him, so its accuracy could be questioned. Theodore learned that in golf, most scorecards reflect something other than the actual number of strokes. Mr. Nance became much more somber when he questioned his client about the day of the murder. And his client responded well. Mr. Duffy's voice grew quieter, scratchy and pained as he talked about his wife's brutal death. I wonder if he's going to cry, Theo asking himself. Pete Duffy held off the tears and did a superb job of describing the horror of hearing the news. Racing home in his golf cart, finding the police there, his wife's body had not been moved. When he saw her collapsed, he had to be assisted by a detective. Later, he was seen by a doctor and given medication to calm down. What a liar, Theo thought. What a phony. You killed your wife. There is a witness. And I have your gloves hidden at the office. Pete Duffy talked about the nightmare of calling her family, his family, their friends, and planning an endural during the funeral and burial. The loneliness, the emptiness of living in the same house where his dear wife had been murdered. The thought of selling it and moving it away. The daily trips to the cemetery. Then the horror of being suspected, accused, indicted, arrested, and put on trial. How could anyone suspect him in the murder of a woman he loved and adored? He finally broke down. He struggled to control himself, and he wiped his eyes repeatedly. I'm sorry, he said over and over. It was very moving. And Theo watched the faces of the jurors. Total sympathy. Total belief. Duffy was trying to save his life, and it was working. His client tried to regain his composure. Clifford Nance decided they had scored enough. He announced, "No more questions, Your Honor. We tender the witness." Mr. Jack Hogan stood up immediately and said, "May I suggest a short recess, Your Honor?" A recess would break the action, take the jurors away from the emotional testimony that they had just heard. And it was after 3:30. Everyone needed a break. 15 minutes, said Judge Gantry. Then we'll start the cross-examination. 15 minutes dragged into 30. He's running out the clock. It's Friday afternoon. Everyone's tired. He'll send the jury home and we'll come back Monday. I don't know about that, said Woods Boone. He might want the final arguments this afternoon. They were huddled in the hallway near the soft drink machines. Other little groups of spectators were waiting, watching the clocks on the wall. Omar Cheap appeared and needed something to drink. He put coins in the machine, made a selection, and glanced at the Boones. He got his can from the dispenser. Ike just kept talking. Hogan won't touch him. He's too slick. The jury will find him not guilty in less than an hour, said Woods. He's walking, said Theo. I really need to get back to the office, said Woods. So do I, said Ike. Typical Boones. Neither made a move because both wanted to see the end of the trial, though. Theo was just glad they were together and having discussion. This was a rarity. Remember that Ike and Woods are brothers. That's how he's Uncle Ike. Okay. There was movement in the hall, and a crowd began to shuffle toward the courtroom. A few had left during the recess. It was, after all, Friday afternoon. When they were inside and seated again, a quiet Judge Gantry assumed his position on the bench and nodded at Jack Hogan. It was time for the cross-examination. When a defendant was on the stand and the prosecutor had the right to question him aggressively, the result was usually pretty ugly. Jack Hogan walked to the witness stand and handed Pete Duffy a document. Do you recognize this, Mr. Duffy? Yes. Please tell the jury what it is. It's a foreclosure notice. On which property? Rick's Road Shopping Center. Here in Strattonburg? Yeah. And the Rick's Road Shopping Center is owned by you, Mr. Duffy? Yes, and a partner. And the bank sent you that foreclosure notice in September of last year because you were behind on quarterly payments on the mortgage. Is that correct? Well, that's what the bank said. Do you agree, Mr. Duffy? Are you telling this jury that you were not behind in the mortgage payments on this property of September last year? Yes, we were behind in the payments. And the bank had loaned you how much money on this property? $200,000. $200,000, he said out loud and looked at the jurors. Now, Mr. Duffy, did you own a warehouse on Wolf Street in the industrial park here in Strattonburg? Yes, sir. I have 2 partners in that deal. And you sold the warehouse, didn't you? Yeah, we sold it. And the sale took place last September, right? If you say so, I'm sure you have the paperwork. Indeed, I do have the paperwork. And my paperwork shows that the warehouse was on the market for a year, the asking price of $600,000. The mortgage at the bank was $550,000, and that you and your partners finally sold it for just over $400,000. Do you agree, Mr. Duffy? That sounds right. So, and what I'm saying here is you lost a big chunk of money on that deal. Right, Mr. Duffy? It was not one of my better deals. Were you desperate to sell the warehouse? No. Did you need the cash, Mr. Duffy? My partners and I just needed to sell the warehouse. So for the next 20 minutes, it went on and on. Hogan hammered away at Pete Duffy and his partners and their financial troubles. Duffy refused to admit that he had been desperate, but as the cross-examination grew stressful, it became obvious that the witness had been scrambling to prop up one deal while another one fell through. Hogan had plenty of paperwork. He produced copies of 2 lawsuits that had been filed against him by his ex-partners. He grilled the witness about these lawsuits. Duffy adamantly denied he was at fault and explained that neither case had merit. But he did freely admit that his business was struggling. Jack Hogan did a masterful job of portraying Duffy as a cash-starved wheeler dealer who barely managed to stay one step ahead of his creditors. But linking his problems to the motive for the murder was still a stretch. Changing subjects, he began to position himself again. He poked around the issue of the troubled marriage. Now, Mr. Duffy, you testified you actually moved out. Is that correct? It is. And it lasted for 1 month of separation? I wouldn't call it a separation. We never called it a separation. Well, then what is it called? We just didn't bother to give it a name. Fair enough. When did you move out? Hey, I don't keep a journal. It was sometime July, last year. 3 months before her murder? Yeah, something like that. Where did you live after you moved out? I'm not sure. I actually moved, sir. I took some clothes and left. Where did you go? I spent a few nights at the Marriott just down the street. I spent a few nights with one of my partners. He's divorced and he lives alone. It was a pretty lousy month. So you were just here and there for a month? Yeah, that's right. Then you moved back home, patched things up with Mrs. Duffy, and you were in the process of living happily ever after when she was murdered. Is that a question? Strike it. Strike that question. Here's a question for you, Mr. Duffy. He gave him a piece of paper. Do you recognize this? I'm not sure. Allow me to help. That's a 4-page lease for an apartment in Weeksburg, 30 miles away. It's for a nice 2-bedroom furnished apartment in a swanky building. $2,000 a month. Does this ring a bell, Mr. Duffy? Not really. A 1-year lease, beginning in June. It isn't signed by me, said Mr. Duffy. No, but it's signed by your secretary, Miss Judith Mays, a woman who lived with her husband at the same address in Strattonburg for the last 20 years. She is my secretary. Why would she sign a lease for such an apartment? Maybe you should ask her. Mr. Duffy, do you really want me to call her here as a witness? Yeah, go ahead. Have you ever seen this apartment, Mr. Duffy? Duffy was rattled and dazed and clinging to a slippery slope. He looked at the jury box, offered a fake smile, and replied, I've stayed there a couple of times. Alone? Of course it was alone. I was there on business. Things ran late. I stayed in the apartment. How convenient. Who's paying the rent? I don't know. You'll have to ask Mrs. Mays, my secretary. So you're telling the jury, Mr. Duffy, that you did not lease this apartment and you're not paying the rent? Yes, that's correct. And you've only stayed there a couple of times? That's correct. And the leasing of the apartment has nothing to do with the problems that you and Mrs. Duffy were having. I didn't lease the apartment. To Theo, who knew the truth, Pete Duffy's honesty had been severely questioned. It seemed obvious he was lying about the apartment. And if he told one lie, he certainly could tell another. Jack Hogan had no way to prove how often Duffy had used the apartment. He moved on. The subject of golf, and then the cross-examination kind of lost its steam. Duffy knew much more about the golf than the prosecutor, and they haggled and bickered for an hour. It was almost 6 o'clock at night when Jack Hogan finally sat down. Judge Gantry wasted no time. I've decided not to hold court tomorrow. I think the jurors need a break. I hope you have a quiet and restful weekend, and I'll see you here at 9 Monday morning. At that time, we'll have closing arguments, and then you'll finally get the case for voting and deliberation. Again, my instructions. Do not discuss this case. If anyone contacts you and attempts to discuss the case, notify me immediately. Thank you for your service. I will see you all, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, on Monday. The bailiffs escorted the jurors through a side door. Once they were gone, Judge Gantry looked at the lawyers and said, Gentlemen, anything more? Nothing at this time, Your Honor. Clifford Nance stood and shook his head no. Very well. The court is adjourned until 9 Monday morning. He did it. All right, it's getting down to it. We're kind of 40 pages away. I'll go a little more. It's only 10:51. I appreciate you all being here. Chapter 18. So he followed Ike's advice. For the first time in several nights, Theo slept well. He awoke late Saturday morning, but by the time he and Judge his dog staggered downstairs, he was aware that a family meeting of some variety was underway in the kitchen. His father was scrambling eggs. His mother, still in her nightrobe, sat at one end of the table, pecking a keyboard and studying the monitor. And Ike, who to Theo's knowledge had not been present in the house during 13 years that Theo had been on the earth, sat at the other end of the table with the morning newspaper in front of him. He was studying the classified ads and making notes. He was wearing his faded orange jogging suit and old Yankees cap. The air was thick with the smell of breakfast, and conversations interrupted and unfinished. Judge went straight to the stove and started begging for breakfast. Wow, so his Uncle Ike hadn't been there in 13 years. Whoa. Various versions of good morning were exchanged. Theo walked to the stove and looked at the food. All eggs are scrambled, his father said. His father cooked even less than his mother, and the eggs still looked a little bit uncooked, in Theo's opinion. He poured himself grapefruit juice and took a seat. No one spoke until Ike said, Here's a 2-bedroom garage apartment in Millmont, $600 a month. It's not a bad part of town. Millmont's okay, said Mr. Boone. She makes $7 an hour and works 30 hours a week. After taxes and a few necessities, she'll be lucky to have $300 a month for rent. She can't afford this $2,000 apartment. That's why they're living in this shelter. So where do you think we'll find an apartment for $300 a month? Ike asked with a slight edge to his voice. He did not look up. Theo just listened and watched. Mr. Boone said, If it's a garage apartment, then it's probably a single owner. Oh, they're talking about the El Salvadors. I doubt if they'll rent to El Salvadorans or anyone else who's not from here. Thanks. Judge finally got some eggs in his bowl. Theo took a bite, chewed slowly, listened to the silence. The eggs were way too mushy to eat. Theo finally said, We're apartment hunting? Ike managed to grunt, Uh-huh. El Salvadorans, living at the shelter. The clues were adding up. Woods, said Mrs. Boone. Nick Wetzel advertises for immigration work. Is he a reputable lawyer? I've never met him. He advertises a lot. He used to be on television begging for car wrecks. I'd stay away from him. We have 2 lawyers in town that mention immigration work. Talk to both of them. I suppose so, said Mrs. Boone. What are we doing here? Theo finally said. We're having a busy day, Theo, his father said. You and I have a very important golf game, too. Theo couldn't express a smile. They played almost every Saturday, but the past several days, Theo had forgotten about this. Great, when? We're going to leave in 30 minutes. 30 minutes later, they're putting their clubs in the back of Mrs. Boone's SUV and talking about how beautiful the weather was. Dad, where are we going? It was obvious they weren't headed to the municipal golf course. We're checking out a new course today. Which one? Waverly Creek. Awesome, Dad. That's the scene of the crime. Yeah, something like that. I have a client who lives out there and he invited us to play. He won't be around though, just the two of us. We'll play the course. Maybe there won't be a crowd. 10 minutes later, they pulled into the rather grand entrance of Waverly Creek. So what's up? The Boones are trying to find lawyers, an apartment, maybe legal work for the Salvadoran family, Julio's family. And now him and his dad are playing the course that Pete Duffy played when he murdered his wife. Good morning, the guard said with a smile. Good morning. The name is Woods Boone. We're here to play a little golf. Tee time 10:40. We're guests of Max Kilpatrick. The guard said his notes. Welcome, Mr. Boone. Put this on your dashboard, please. He handed a bright yellow card and said, Hit him good. Hit him straight. Thanks, said Mr. Boone. Theo had been, the gates began to open. Theo had been through them once before, a couple years earlier for a birthday party of a friend who since moved away. He remembered the very large homes. The course was so manicured, like something out of a golf magazine. There were golfers taking practice swings. Theo began to fret. He liked 18 holes with his dad on an uncrowded course, but nothing was more unpleasant than trying to hit a ball with a foursome waiting and watching impatiently from behind you. The clubhouse was busy. Dozens of golfers were out on this fine day. Mr. Boone checked with the starter, got a cart, and began limbering up for practice. Theo couldn't help but look around, help catch a glimpse of Julio's cousin. Maybe he might see Pete Duffy himself. He had posted bond the day of his arrest, and he had never seen a jail cell. The way the trial was going, it seemed unlikely he would be locked up. But Theo did not see either person. The fact he was thinking about them meant that he was not thinking about his golf swing. They teed off on time, Mr. Boone from the blue trees, Theo from the white tees, not trees, sorry, a little further down the fairway. His drive was a line shot that barely covered 100 yards. Keep your head down, his father said. Mr. Boone had been playing golf for 30 years and was just an average golfer, but like most golfers, he could not resist the urge to give advice. There was a foursome in front of them and no one behind. The course was narrower, shorter, less favored by other golfers. It was designed to sort of follow the winding route of Waverly Creek itself, a pretty treacherous little stream known to devour golf balls. The North 9 and the South 9 were crowded, but not the creek course itself. They sat in the cart by the tee box and waited for the foursome to put out the number 3. Okay, Theo, here's the plan. Ike is looking for an apartment for the family. Something small, something affordable. If they need a little help with the rent, then your mother and I can kick in some money. This is something we've been talking about for several months, so it's nothing new. Ike, who's got a big heart but a small bank account, is willing to help too. If we can find a place real fast, and maybe Corolla can convince her nephew, Julio's cousin, to live with them, it would be a much more stable environment for all of them. Ike is searching right now, and your mother's talking to immigration attorneys. There might be a way under federal law to allow an illegal immigrant to become legal if he has a sponsor who's a U.S. citizen. If he has a job, too. Let's hit. They teed off, got back in the cart, and eased along the path. Mr. Boone continued. Your mother and I are willing to sponsor Julio's cousin. I can probably find him a better job, and even a legitimate one, if he lives with his aunt and her family, and he can probably obtain a legal status within 2 years. Full citizenship is another matter, though. So what's the catch? There's no catch. We want to help the Pena family get out of the shelter, and we'll do so regardless of what happens to the cousin. But we have to convince him to come forward and be willing to testify, to tell the truth, to take the witness stand and tell the jury what he saw. How are we going to convince him of that? That part of the plan, we are still evolving. All right, it's almost 11, so I'm going to pause here. We're very close to the conclusion of this book. There's 36 more pages. So, you'll have to pick it up on Monday. And I'll be seeing the 4th grade very shortly. So I'm going to pause here. We're very close to the 36 more pages. So, you'll have to pick it up Monday. And I'll be seeing the 4th grade